Hi, this lecture focuses on writing IEP objectives. One of the things that is helpful when you're learning how to write these objectives is knowing that the format that we use is also effective when writing just your regular lesson plan objectives. So for those of you who are not intervention specialist majors, you'll still be able to find what we're talking about in this lecture very helpful and very useful. Whenever you do EdTPA, which is the large project that you do during student teaching, they will expect you to be able to write objectives in this format. So keep that in mind as we work through these. Make sure you have your guided notes with you because I'll reference them throughout this lecture. I'm going to probably just leave it open in this way that you're viewing it here so that I can easily toggle back and forth. So this is what we're talking about today. This is the goal page that hopefully should look familiar from the IEP, your IEP treasure hunt. So whenever you're writing the IEP, the profile section will take a lot of time, but where you will spend most of your time and where you are, let's say, most often opening yourself for litigation is with the measurable annual goals and objectives. And this is the page. Also note that this is section 6, and even though within section 6 we'll just look at this one page, everything that's identified in the ETR as an area of weakness for the student must be addressed. So you will have one of these pages for everything that is considered a weakness. So you will likely have multiple measurable annual goals. So you'll have this page repeated multiple times within your IEP with those different areas of weakness. The first part that we'll talk about is just what's on this particular page. And the first is present levels. And that is this box right here. And this is where you'll put data regarding where the student is currently performing in the area that you've identified here. So an area that would go here typically would be a subject area. So you could put language arts, you could put reading, you could put math fluency, math computation, written expression. Sometimes you'll see things here like transition skills, organizational skills, behavioral skills. That's the area that you would put. And then in here you just provide any data from the ETR, but also any data from your classes or other data that you've collected from the classroom. That's what would go here. Just so we know where the student is, and this data should reflect that the student is struggling in this particular area. The next part is the measurable annual goal, and that goes here. And this is where you'll put what the student should be able to do by the end of one more calendar year. So most often, at least in my experience with the older students, you will just have an annual goal. You'll write down the method, and the method refers to this. So how are you going to be assessing the goal that you've written here? Are you going to be using a curriculum-based measure? Are you going to be doing some observations, checklists, performance assessment using work samples or specific rubrics? You would just put the corresponding letter in here that says how you're assessing this particular goal. You will sometimes see, so if this is what you're to attain in 1 year, then what you could do is set short-term measurable objectives that are written in the exact same format with the idea of this is what they should be able to achieve in a shorter amount of time, and this is what we would be working on after that, after that, after that, with the goal of all of these objectives getting the student to being able to meet this particular annual goal. Or at the high school level, and it really just depends too on what the subject area is. We didn't always use these short-term objectives, but you definitely want to do things like that for younger students, for students with more significant disabilities. I always recommend looking at the IEPs of your colleagues, what they've written, because usually most districts have unspoken, but sometimes spoken ways that they write the IEPs. So making sure you're following along with what everyone in the district is doing. So, but regardless, whether you're writing the annual goal or the short-term objectives, they'll be written in the same legal format. This last part It talks about how often you're going to be reporting the child's progress to their parents and how you're going to be doing it. In general, legally, you have to provide data on each of the objectives and annual goals to the student's parents as often as they're receiving grade cards, which is usually every 9 weeks or so. So every 9 weeks or so, you're giving parents a copy of all of the current data related to every objective. Parents may, depending on what the objective is, may want more frequent information on this. For example, if it's a behavioral goal and the parents want to be able to implement some sort of intervention at home, they may need to know every day or every week how the student performed in this particular area in order to give them the reinforcement or to not give them the reinforcement that they earn. Right, so this is something that parents ultimately decide what goes here, but legally, at the very, very least, you're providing it every 9 weeks to the parents. All right. So when looking at the measurable annual goal, obviously within that term tells you that this is what the student should be able to attain by the end of the calendar year, related to any deficits that are identified in the ETR. One of the things that's very important is a huge movement towards making sure these annual goals are aligned with content standards, meaning you want to make sure that your goal is to get students to a level, the same level as their typical peers in that particular area. And this is why it's very important to have an actively participating general education teacher on the IEP team. As a special education teacher, it's impossible for you to know the content standards from kindergarten to 12th grade because that's when your licensure area is K to 12. There's no way you're going to learn the content standards for all of those grade levels. So the general education teacher is technically the content area expert. So you want to be able to depend on them to make sure whatever these goals are that are being written into the IEP are in line with what other students without disabilities are working towards, as much as that is possible. This is very important. So you'll hear what are the 4 elements of a legal IEP objective, and these are the 4. The first is the condition, the second is the student, the third is a behavior, and the fourth is a criteria. The fifth, this is a part of it, but down here is where you're doing that. So it's not something you have to write into the objective, it's already on the form. So remember the first 4. We'll talk about each of those. Right, the first is the condition. So every IEP objective, at least at this point in time, it should start with the word given, and then you will write exactly what the evaluation will look like for the student. So if on this objective you're going to be assessing their ability to complete something on a worksheet, then the condition becomes given a worksheet. If you're going to be using a set of sight words and asking the student to be able to say those sight words, then your condition becomes given Dolch sight words. So whatever it is that you're going to ask the student to do, there are certain materials or certain expectations that everyone that's going to be assessing the objective will need to know. And that's what is the given, or that's what the condition is. So for an example, if you look at the second page of your guided notes, where it says poorly written condition. So what I want you to do is pause this in a second and read this scenario. And then I'm going to ask you, after you read it, to try to determine what it is that Ms. Samuels thinks the condition is and what it is that you think Mr. Watson believes the condition is. So pause it now, read that, and come up with those 2 conditions. Okay, so after reading that, what we can see is that there was some general confusion. They both thought that they were teaching Harvey to do long division. And the intervention specialist even took care to try to make sure they were using the same steps. But the confusing point was that Ms. Samuels believed the condition was given a worksheet containing long division, whereas Mr. Watson believed the condition was Given the textbook and notebook paper, Harvey will copy down the long division problems and solve them. And the reason why this is important, just in my own experience when you're working with kids with disabilities, if you're truly trying to assess if they know long division, asking them to copy a problem down from a book onto notebook paper, what you're also inadvertently assessing is their ability to copy down those problems correctly, accurately. And there are often mistakes made in that area. So when students are getting the problems wrong, it doesn't mean that they don't know long division, it means they weren't able to copy it correctly. So then you're inadvertently assessing a skill that you're not trying to assess, that's not really relevant to what it is you're trying to accomplish with the student. So that's an example of a poorly written condition, or not having aligned conditions and what can happen when everyone isn't on the same page with what exactly that assessment should look like. The second aspect of a legal objective is the student's name, just straightforward. So given a worksheet containing long division, Harvey will, so it's just saying the student's name. The third is the behavior. The number one thing that trips people up with this skill is making sure that the behavior is truly observable. And knowing if something is observable, it really requires you to picture what it looks like and if it would look the same no matter who was looking at the behavior. So for example, what I do in my in-seat classes, I give this objective example. Given 10 vocabulary terms each week, so that's my condition, Maya will know the definition with 90% accuracy in 6 of 9 trials. And then I ask them to say, how will you assess this objective? And so when looking at that particular objective, the idea is that you're going to see if a student knows the definition of vocabulary terms. But what does it mean to know the definition? So in this example, the behavior is knowing, to know, will know the definition. There's probably, at least probably 20 or more ways that you can assess if a student knows the definition, right? You can do matching, you can do a multiple choice, where you give the student the definition and then you ask them to circle the correct term, or you can do it the other way where you give the term and provide possible definitions and have them circle the right definition. You could do crossword puzzles. You can show them a vocabulary term on a flashcard and ask them to say the definition aloud. So just spitballing in that way, you can see there's a million different ways that you could tell if a student knows the definition. But knowing the definition in those ways, it's not aligned. Those are all very different ways to know a word. I probably could ask you what an IEP is, what an ETR is, and provide you with the multiple choice options, and you could probably get it right. Whereas if I said to you as an open-ended question, what is an IEP? Tell me about it. Right? Those are very different questions. One's a little bit easier to answer than the other. So that's why it's really important to be very specific with what the behavior is that you want to get from the student. So what may clear this up would be to say, given 10 vocabulary terms each week on flashcards, Maya will say the definition aloud. One of the other issues with this particular objective is that 90% accuracy it's not always clear what that means. Does this mean that she should know 9 out of 10? Does it mean that she should overall be 90% accurate with what she's saying with her definitions? But that's criteria. So as long as it's clear to who's implementing this, it's okay. But always try to think about the criteria too to see does it make sense. And we will talk a little bit more about that too. So let's look at the special education problems, the behavior aspect. Right. So again, I'm going to ask you to pause this. I'm going to ask you to read this scenario, and then I want you to write down the two teachers in the scenario, Ms. Wilberforce and Ms. Folden. I want you to write down what each of them believe the observable behavior is, and they're not the same. So go ahead and pause it. Okay, so after reading that, it's clear that what one of the teachers thought knowing the vowels are is different from what the other one thinks it means to know. Right, so saying I want them to know the vowels, you can see how that's not observable, because to know the vowels, it's very different depending on who you ask, what it means to know vowels. So in this case, Ms. Wilberforce, her behavioral objective behavior was, will be able to say aloud each vowel sound, whereas Ms. Fulton thought the intention was that the student will be able to vocally name all of the vowels. Right. So Ms. Fulton thought it was naming the vowels. Ms. Wilberforce meant we'll be able to know the vowel sounds. Right. So that's just an example of why it's important to have a clear, truly observable behavior. Right. I also provided on the notes examples of observable terms to use when you're writing IEP objectives. So this last page, the first part of the table says verbs that are directly observable. The next one is ambiguous, meaning they can be if you add a few more descriptors. And the last one is you actually often see a lot of these in IEP objectives and lesson objectives, but they are not actually observable. So taking a look at some of these, you'll sometimes see the student will be able to recognize the main idea. Right? But what does it mean to recognize it? Are they underlining it? Are they stating it aloud? Are they making a connection? And then where it's ambiguous, let's take a look at subtract. So the student will be able to subtract double-digit numbers. Right? So if before that it says maybe given a worksheet, the student will be able to subtract. So when there's a worksheet, we obviously understand that there's going to be, the student will be writing the answers, right? Or it could say given flashcards, the student will be able to subtract and state the correct answer. So as long as there's other descriptors, these words can be used. And these are the ones that I highly recommend because they are always directly observable. To underline, to write, to count orally, to say, to read orally, to name, to state. So you can see how when I say the student will be able to state the vowels, we can have 10 people sitting around the room collecting data on whether or not that student can state the vowels, and our data would probably all look exactly the same because we understand that the student should be saying A, E, I, O, U. Right? But when we say other things, like the student will be able to know the vowels. Again, like our example we just took a look at, that could look different for different people. They might interpret what it means to know as completely different behaviors. But use these in the future. Use them when you're writing lesson objectives and use them when you're writing IEP objectives. So always keep this with you. Okay. And the last element of a legal IEP objective is the criteria. And the criteria can trip people up. Criteria refers to at what degree should the student be able to demonstrate that skill. So if the student's learning a very new skill, or possibly a very difficult skill, or if the student has significant disabilities, what we would assume to be the importance of how accurate they need to be, it could be a little bit lower. It's also possible that you increase the criteria within your IEP short-term objectives. So maybe if you're teaching a student to read fluently, your overall annual goal would be that they'd be able to get to, let's say, 200 words per minute. And each short-term objective could be they're reading 100 words per minute and then 120 words per minute, the next objective. The next objective can be 130 words per minute, so that accuracy or that criteria can increase in a way to get the student to meet the annual goal. You can also include things like trials. So, how many times should the student be able to demonstrate this particular skill? So, some skills, let's say tying a shoe, if you're teaching a student to tie their shoe, saying they'd be able to do it with 100% accuracy one time, that's great. But does that mean that they truly know how to do it, or do they get lucky this time? So sometimes it's important that a student demonstrates the skill multiple times over multiple trials in order to determine if they've truly mastered that skill. So all of these, as far as criteria, are very dependent upon what the skill is, depending on the student's ability levels, and sometimes it depends on the district. I was in a district where 90%, it just was generally accepted, whatever the skill was, you're putting 90%. 80% isn't good enough, and 100% isn't realistic. All right, so that was just how we did it. That doesn't mean that's necessarily what's right. But again, one more reason to take a look at some of the IEPs that your colleagues have written to get a general idea of what that particular district sees as normal. And this is hard to teach without showing you a couple examples. But the thing that trips people up with criteria is you get caught up in putting the 80%, the 90%, the 100% without taking a look at, in general, does it make sense? So what you're doing, does it actually make sense? All right. So this, back to the special ed problems, take a look at the poorly written criteria. Again, pause this in a second and try to think through, what does Mr. Henderson believe is the mastery criteria, and what do the parents believe is the mastery criteria? So go ahead and pause that. Okay, so after reading this, the target behavior was toilet training, and in Mr. Henderson's view, his criteria was that the student should be able to use the restroom appropriately with no more than 3 accidents per week. That was his mastery criteria. So he considered 2 or 3 accidents as good, and the student has mastered the ability to do that. Whereas the parents thought that true mastery was that student would be able to use the restroom with no accidents or 100% of the time. Right, so that's a different criteria determined to be mastery. Some more examples I want to share just to make sure it's somewhat clear. So what is wrong with this criteria? Given one vocal instruction to sit down, that's my condition, Justin, that's my student, and my observable behavior, will sit in his chair with pockets on the seat and legs on the floor, and my criteria, with 90% accuracy by the end of the first 9 weeks. So think about that for a second. What is wrong with this criteria? Consider what 90% looks like. One of the things you can do is take that criteria and picture in your head what 90% accuracy is in relation to that objective. So in this particular behavior, the student's sitting in his chair with pockets on the seat and legs on the floor. How does one do that with 90% accuracy? Hopefully that you see that that doesn't make sense. How do you sit on the floor with 90% accuracy, right? Is there a leg stretched out to the side? Is one pocket not touching the ground? It's hard to determine what that would look like because you don't sit with 90% accuracy, so that does not make sense in this particular example. But I have seen often where people just slap down 90% accuracy without taking a second to see, does it make sense? All right, another example. The condition. When asked a WH question, Justin will orally answer the question with 90% accuracy and 9 out of 10 trials by the end of the first 9 weeks. Okay, so just to think through this, in this evaluation, the teacher is saying, Justin, where are you from? And then Justin has to have an accurate answer, right? And the reason why this particular one says 9 out of 10 trials, which does make sense, is that that means 10 different times Justin's being asked a WH question. So, and this is important because just saying one time, where are you from, doesn't get at whether Justin's truly able to answer WH questions. Later on, you'll have to say, why did you do that, Justin? Or where did you do that? Right, so you have to ask multiple WH questions to see if he's truly reached mastery. But the true issue with this particular criteria is that when you're asking a question, where are you from? How do you answer that 90%? Right? What's the answer in which you would give him a 90%? For the most part, it's right or wrong. For the most part, WH questions are right or wrong. So 90% is just awkward. It's almost better to say, we'll answer it correctly or incorrectly no more than one time, or answer it correctly 9 out of 10 trials. So that 90% accuracy doesn't make sense here. All right, so those are the 4 elements of the legal IEP objective. The first is the condition. The condition should include whatever you're going to be using for that evaluation, so that anybody doing the evaluation will be doing it the exact same way. Second is the student name. The third is the observable behavior. And it's important that this is truly observable, so that if I wrote this objective, I could hand it to any one of you and you would all come up with the exact same data, because you know exactly what the student should be doing. It's observable. You should be able to all see it or not see it. It shouldn't be confusing, such as, what does it mean to know? What does it mean to understand? It must be something that you can you see it? Can you hear it? Right? Those are 2 great questions you can ask when you write a behavioral objective. Is my observable behavior something I can see? Or is it something I can hear? Then it is truly observable. And the last is the criteria. And the criteria just asks you to determine to what degree of accuracy will the student be able to do that in order for you to consider that he or she has mastered it, and then can move on to another objective. Right? And you have to make sure that that criteria makes sense. Right? So within these guided notes I gave you, I gave this sample of a measurable annual goal page of the IEP, so you can connect what we're talking about. The second was just examples, and you can read through the explanations if you would like. I often refer back to this. I think this is just a wonderful way of looking at, probably a little cheesy, I get that, but I think it does do a good job of illustrating what happens when these elements are not written in the way that they're intended. This next page is my little practice page. You totally can just ignore it or not do anything with it. In my in-person classes, we do this together for extra practice, but that's not a requirement of this class. You do not have to do this page at all, but you can certainly look through it and try it if you want, but you can ignore it, and that's fine. And then this is just some sample verbs that are observable and not observable and ambiguous, so that these will hopefully help you in the future. So keep this with you. Make sure you know where it is. Right, so after this, I invite you to go ahead and take the quiz that's related to these objectives.